At this point, yeah, we are starting to record. I serve at Eastern Mennonite University as the Dean of our School of Social Sciences and Professions, and I would love to know what the rest of you do. And I'll start with Paul, or at least what part of the country you're in and what interests you in this conversation.
No, I'm in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, Lancaster County. Um, I work for the state doing IT work. Um, I'm very interested in people in general and the things that are and the things that influence them in the way that they see the world and respond to what's happening in it and cause things to happen.
So you're a neighbor of Conrad and Heidi if you're in E-Town.
We're in the same place. I met Conrad one time, but that was, at a church service.
Well, thank you. And Ken.
I'm from Saskatoon. Actually, we met at a conference here in Saskatoon many years ago.
Yes.
I'm a retired intentional interim pastor.
With Mennonite or other denomination?
Mennonite, yeah.
Okay.
Mennonite church, yeah.
Thank you. I remember that time in Saskatoon. It was lovely. And Hal?
Well, I grew up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, actually in Elizabethtown, and Lancaster Conference Mennonite, small farm there. And I had an early interest in Anabaptist history and genealogy and things related to that. And then I went to Goshen 1 year in college and Elizabethtown College the other 3. And I guess, as part of the things that happened to you in life, I got involved with evangelical circles through an uncle that was a founder of a local evangelical church. So I've kind of experienced that side of things, and it has its pros and cons, like a lot of things. And I got interested in why people that were so devoted to the supposedly literal translation of what the Bible said, yet came to some of the conclusions they had, which is kind of an ongoing thing in my life, as those of you that share social media with me probably see. And so semi-retired, living in Florida. My career was procurement and contracting. I was head of procurement and contracting for the city of Palm Springs for 21 years, among other places. And but I would say that my continuing interest is just in terms of the dynamics that drive churches today and why we're in the situation sometimes that we are.
Well, I must say, Hal, since we are Facebook friends, you have some of the funniest posts that I've ever read. So thank you for that.
I hope you enjoy it.
So Mildred, and you're with someone.
Yeah, hello, my name is Millie, and my husband Wes and I are pastors at an LMC congregation currently in Millersville, Pennsylvania, right in Lancaster County. I think we would call ourselves lay leaders who got chosen to be pastors. This was not part of our life plan, but we've now been pastoring almost 9 years together. So we're co-pastors together at this church. So, and yeah, the church part is the part that interests us. Really, I don't know if Wes has anything else he wants to add.
Oh, that's good.
Okay, so Millie and Wes, and your co-pastors in Millersville. Great, welcome. David, if you can hear me, and yes, thanks for turning your mic on.
Sure. David Martino. I'm a pastor at a newer to LMC congregation in Aurora, Ohio, and navigating COVID, looking beyond it and looking at exciting possibilities, wondering what God has in store. And I've read some of your material, and I'm just looking forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you, David. And Sarah, if you could turn your mic on.
Hi, I am a stay-at-home mom in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I have absolutely zero credentials of any kind. And you might hear some cartoons in the background. I started coming out of the institutional evangelical church about 3 years ago. I finally read the whole Bible for myself instead of just having it interpreted for me. And I kind of realized that what was going on in the Bible isn't what I was being told about at church. Not only I grew up in a very, very liberal denomination of Protestantism, and then as I grew up, moved into kind of the evangelical Baptist megachurch movement. And yeah, just when I started reading the Bible, I really realized that it wasn't lining up, especially kind of the celebrity superstar pastor and the big bands and the lights and sounds and the coffee bar and all that. And so I just started looking into other traditions and other options and other things, came across Anabaptism, interested in, house church movement and all that kind of thing.
Wow, thank you. And by the way, since you are a mom, you have substantial leadership and management experience, because that comes with being a parent. I know that personally. So thank you all for introducing yourselves. I'm going to share several things that I've learned along the way in working with congregations, and then I'd really love to hear your response to that. I'll give some time for it. I've been consulting with congregations since 1986, so just about 35 years. Started out in Lancaster Conference. In fact, the first congregation I worked with many years ago was in the E-Town area, and have had the opportunity since then to work with about 50 congregations and about 50 other mostly faith-based organizations. That's what I know best and what I work with. But I have never seen a year like this past year, and I'm sure that's true for all of you. It's not just the global pandemic. It is also the national racial reckoning. The pandemic started for most of us in March, the racial reckoning in May with the death of George Floyd. And then an election crisis on top of that in November. So that 2020 was truly a remarkable year, and I think historians will look back on it that way. And I'll have to say, because I'm currently consulting with two congregations, neither one in the Mennonite tradition, one in Ohio, one in Florida, and all three of those are impacting these congregations in different ways. The one in Florida, Hal, this won't surprise you, describes itself as a purple congregation in a purple state. And what happens in a polarized environment, which we've had in this country, growing polarization for 40 years, but currently really it is at a peak. What happens in a polarized environment is that everything becomes polarized. So even something as simple as wearing a mask can take on political overtones. And they can be very strong on both ends of that spectrum. So this particular congregation has decided to continue with virtual services and not reopen. And some of their members see that as a lack of faith, that if they really had faith, they would be fully open and not require people to wear masks. So this is the reality that congregations and pastoral leaders and lay leaders are faced with, is that we're dealing with three crises at once, and that all three of those crises impact congregations. Now, why do they impact congregations? This is what Conrad wanted me to talk about. If you remember a book that came out about 20 years ago by a fellow named Putnam from Harvard, it's called Bowling Alone, and he was charting the decline of social capital in the United States, how there used to be bowling leagues and now people just show up individually and bowl. There used to be great enrollment in clubs like the Elks Club and the Rotary, and they've been in serious decline. Congregations are also numerically in decline as a whole, but as Putnam said, there is no other group that gathers as many people on a weekly basis as religious congregations. There's no institution that comes close. And so congregations are the greatest source of social capital that we have, not only in this country, but around the world. And when I use the term congregations, I'm talking about mosques and synagogues, as well as Christian churches, that all of those religious congregations, in fact, I've worked with the Hindu ashram, all of those congregations are the major source of social capital. So when the country is pulling apart, we need to rely even more on our religious congregations as a place that pull people together. But the reality is we will be subject to those external forces, just like every other institution in society and just like every family in society. So since I can see most of you, and I don't know, David and Sarah, if you're able to turn on your video, but if so, I would be grateful. Thank you. I would just be curious, by show of hands, how many of you have had a relationship with someone you care about? Maybe not an immediate family member, but an extended family member or a friend. How many of you have had a relationship disrupted by the reality of the polarization in our society over the last year or two? I have. Just curious if anybody else. Not, Millie and her husband are checking in to see. So that's probably about the national average, that when they do surveys, it's about half the people that report, yes, there's been a significant disruption in a personal relationship that I care about because of those influences. And it only got worse over the last year because of the very differing responses to the pandemic. So let me talk about what I see as the three major causes of conflict in congregations, and then I'll talk about three responses, and then I want to make sure that there's time for you all to respond. So what causes conflict in congregations? I decided to study this for my dissertation, which was now about almost 20 years ago. But I surveyed 100 congregations in the American Southwest, because that's a part of the country that's rapidly changing and growing. And my hypothesis was that there would be some changes that would correlate with conflict and others that would not. So I asked the lead pastors about changes they had experienced in their congregation. And I asked them if they had experienced the conflict significant enough to call in outside help or convene a special meeting in the last 5 years. And there were only 2 changes that significantly statistically correlated with conflict. And I asked about 10 different possibilities. And the two were if they changed their worship service, even if they added a contemporary service. Just any significant change to the worship service tended to correlate with conflict. And why might that be? It's because worship is the most important thing that a congregation does, and worship mediates meaning. It's through the worship service that we experience deep spiritual meaning. So when we mess with the worship service, and sometimes we need to, I mean, we really must, but when we change a worship service or add a worship service, it's likely to correlate with conflict. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It just means that when we do it, we should expect that there will be some resistance and some conflict. So that was one, any change to the worship service. The second was any change to the structure of the congregation, the way it had organized itself. Even a change as relatively simple as from committees to teams correlated with conflict. And why would that be? And that's because the structure of a congregation mediates power. It says who has authority to make certain kind of decisions. And when we mess with power, we tend to also have conflict. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. There are times when we have to reorganize. I've helped many congregations through reorganization. It just means that there is something about power in a congregation that matters to people, and that many conflicts are indeed some form of a power struggle. That's not about bad people doing bad things. It just means that people care about how decisions are made and who's involved in decisions. And if they're not involved, there can be a lot of pushback. So those were the 2 things that correlated with conflict. And the third won't surprise you, and this is from other research beyond my own dissertation. And that is when there are significant changes in the society, such as changing views on marriage and human sexuality. And those changes also come into our congregations. And some people embrace those changes in the broader society. Some people resist those changes. So we end up having conflicts within our churches about how we're going to respond to changes in the broader society. Now, this has been true on multiple issues over time. My father told me that in his generation, it was about ordination of women and divorce and remarriage. And now in our generation, it's been more over same-sex marriage and whether there will be acceptance of LGBT pastors. But the reality is, we don't set out to want to have a fight in our churches about these things. It's that there are changes in the broader society, and those changes impact our congregations. So putting those 3 things together, when there are changes to worship, when there are changes to our power structures, or where there are changes in the broader society that come into and we have discourse about within our congregations, there's likely to be conflict. So, hello. Uh, you're muted. Oh, okay. But it's nice to see your face, so that's fine. So let me just pause and see if you have a response to those three causes of conflict, and then we'll talk about how to respond to them.
You're right on.
You agree. All right, Ken, you've been an interim minister, so you would have seen some of this play out.
All three.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with all three.
And Millie's nodding her head, which I take as a significant sign. Anybody want to add one that you think is another significant cause? David?
Yeah, I'm wondering where you would put just the political disagreement, where racial and political fits in that. Is that society? Because you mentioned marriage and sexuality.
So as our society changes, and one of the biggest changes in American society the last 40 years has been growing political polarization. So that has come into all of our churches in some way, even old order Mennonite ones and Amish. They're impacted by the broader societal discourse. And Hal and I have had some conversation about why white evangelicals have particularly been attracted to Trumpism in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think, to be honest with you, it has more to do with their being white than with their being evangelical. There's a racial dynamic, a response to the changing composition of our society. The fact that white Christians will be a minority by 2050 in America is a significant reality. And so there's a response we call it identity threat to feeling, what will it be like when I, as a white Christian, will be a minority both racially and religiously? And people do respond to that and to messages regarding that. So that other congregations have been affected by Black Lives Matter and have responded to that movement. So you've got both ends of the spectrum and sometimes both ends of the spectrum in one congregation. So I would put all of those under the category of these are dramatic changes in our society that impact our churches because we're nested in a particular society. Just like in Jesus' day, they were nested in the reality of Roman occupation and having slaves and free people within the same congregation, and women and men, and Jews and Gentiles, and they had to deal with those divisions in their time. We deal with them now in our time. Okay, so how do we respond to these realities? There are three conflict transformation approaches that I commend to my clients, and I'll share with you. And the first is to realize that leaders set the tone in every congregation, not just pastors, but lay leaders. So I always try to work with the board or the session or the vestry, as well as with the clergy and the professional leadership in the congregation, because together they constitute the leadership. And as goes the leadership, so goes the congregation. So the most important thing we can do when working with a conflicted congregation is to try to get the leaders on the same page. The lay leaders, as well as the clergy and professional leaders. So if you're able to do that, if you're able to help people agree on what I would say the central commitment to following Jesus, that's the most important thing that we can agree on. Not putting our faith in a Donald Trump or a Joe Biden, because that will always be disappointing. In fact, the scripture is pretty clear. Do not put your faith, your trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save. Psalm 146:3. So a large part of what's been going on, I think, for American Christianity is we have become political animals, putting our trust in political figures rather than in Jesus. And that never ends well. So how do we get leaders on the same page in terms of our commitment to Jesus? The second thing I would say is, if you're a leader, self-define and invite disagreement. So this sounds like a paradox, but there are two styles of leadership that get people in trouble. And Speed Lease found this in the hundreds of churches that he consulted with for the Alban Institute. He said the first style that always gets a pastor in trouble is the authoritarian leader. It's my way or the highway. You're either for me or you're against me. You get on board or you get out of the way. inevitably caused very divisive conflicts. But the second style that caused just as many conflicts was the leader who said, I don't really have an opinion. I'm just here to facilitate your process. It's up to you what you want to do. People got just as mad, and it caused just as much conflict with that second style of undefined leadership, because they knew that the leader had an opinion, that they were frustrated that he or she wouldn't express that opinion, and they saw the person as manipulative. So neither the authoritarian really style or the manipulative style is effective. And instead, we offer from family systems theory the self-defined leader, the leader who's willing to say, this is who I am and this is what I believe, but I'm equally interested in hearing who you are and what you believe. So it's not, this is the truth, end of discussion. It's, I'm sharing with you my core self, my deepest beliefs, and I'm inviting you to do the same. That style is the most effective style of leadership, particularly in congregations. So I'll do one more and then give you a chance to respond. The third, and in some ways perhaps most important step for congregations, is to look outward, to not just focus on ourselves and what's going on in our congregation and our problems, but to look out the window, to engage in mission. The way that I say it is the best antidote to destructive internal conflict is an external focus. If we can be externally focused, if we can be driven by mission, and it doesn't need to mean the whole world, although that's wonderful, it can simply mean the community outside of our church doors. But when we're focused on something external, it's amazing what shifts. So when I did my research, I only found one change that had a negative effect on conflict. And by negative effect on conflict, I simply mean it made conflict less likely. There was only one of these 10 changes that made conflict less likely. And that was when I asked the question, did you in the last 5 years start a ministry or an outreach in your own community? And the congregations that said yes had less conflict, controlling for all the other variables like size and age, had less conflict than the congregations of the same size and age and even denomination that didn't do anything in the last 5 years in their community. So those three things, remember that as goes the leadership, so goes the congregation. So keep leaders together. If you're a leader, self-define and invite disagreement. And to the degree that you can, encourage your congregation to look outward rather than only inward. Really make a difference in terms of conflict and health. So forgive me for talking so long, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and response. Particularly if you disagree.
You're making it difficult by expecting us to disagree.
Well, I'm inviting you to disagree, but also agree. If there's something you want to come back to or add, I'd welcome that.
I could ask something, Dave. Is it possible that focusing outward could be a way of avoiding conflict? Can that be a manipulative tactic that a leader could use?
It could be, but I've seen it happen in 3 different communities that I've been part of. One was in Lancaster, other was in Southern Arizona, and now here in Northern Virginia, where I am. I've seen congregations either individually or together with other congregations join in community ministry. And from what I could tell, it came from a deep place of faith for those who were doing it. So I would imagine you're right. Somebody could do it as a manipulative tactic, but it's not what I've seen in the 3 communities where I've seen it emerge. It's been, this is what God is calling us to do. And here in Harrisonburg, what I've seen emerge is called Faith in Action, and it's 24 congregations, including our local mosque and our local synagogue, working together for positive change in the community. And it's been a very effective and positive ministry. It helps all of us look outward. Other thoughts? So I'll ask you all a question. Or Ken, are you getting ready to speak?
No, not quite yet.
Okay.
Dave, I could ask one more question
Yeah.
if it's free. You mentioned 3 sources of conflict. Do you oftentimes see those in layers, multiple layers happening simultaneously? And do you find that one of them is more destructive than the other from your research?
So in my dissertation research, those congregations that both changed their worship and changed their structure, did both of those things in a 5-year period, were 7 times more likely to have conflict than congregations that did neither of those things. So there was a multiple effect when both happened together. Every congregation has an absorption capacity. They can take so much change at a certain time. And if we overload the absorption capacity, then the conflict is much more likely. On the other hand, those congregations that didn't change anything in the previous 5 years were the most likely to be in decline. So to be really blunt, you can change and have conflict, or you cannot change and die. I mean, those are your 2 options. And it just takes some time for those 2 options to play themselves out.
I'm thinking more about your self-definition and the problem of what you call the manipulative style. And I'm thinking of a couple of congregations I worked with where the issue that was producing a significant part of the conflict was around the sexuality questions. And basically both congregations, as they anticipated a new pastor, each side rather saw the solution as being making sure we get the guy who agrees with us. Mm-hmm. And in those 2 congregations, what we worked toward instead was a recognition that if a pastor comes in with that particular agenda, either way, that isn't going to work. What we actually invited the candidates to do was to respond to questions about where they stood with statements about how they will help us live well together with our disagreements.
Yeah, that's really important, because the real issue is not will we have conflict, because we will. The question is, how will we deal with the disagreements? And that's what you were asking these pastors to address. How will you help us deal with these disagreements? Mm-hmm. So we had a pastor in our Presbyterian congregation in Arizona that I came to really appreciate. And he did a lot of counseling for couples, and he would do premarital counseling with them. And they would come in and say, "Oh, pastor, we're kind of concerned. We had our first argument the other night. And what's that mean for our marriage?" And his line, which I really loved, was, "Well, if the 2 of you agree on everything, one of you is completely unnecessary." So we need to learn how to deal with the disagreements that we'll have. And I've been married for 39 years, and only because my wife and I learned how to disagree. It's very important. Disagree with respect. Although, as she occasionally says to me, it's not what you said, David, it's how you said it. So we're still working on it. Any other comments, because we're moving towards closing?
I was involved in a study when I went to Goshen College, where we went to a different church every Sunday and asked one simple question that was the basic that we asked everyone. And that was, what is your core value that if it was violated, you feel like your involvement with this church would come to an end? Huh. And it was an interesting thing. And in light of this conversation, I just wonder, whether there is a core value that all these people of all these various opinions, but if that's the basis of some of the disagreement, or if it's just that they went their way or something lesser.
I love that question. What's your core value? And when I consult with congregations and sometimes do a survey or a focus group or even individual interviews, the first question I always ask is, what do you most love and appreciate about this congregation? Because I want people to identify things that they really value, which I think you were getting at. And it's amazing, not only the breadth of responses I get to that, but the depth, that often there's really core agreement about 3 to 5 things that people really do love and appreciate, and they don't want to lose. So it's called the appreciative inquiry. It's an appreciative approach to congregational consulting, but it's very important, especially when there's conflict, that we get people talking about what they value, what's important to them, what they love. And what I tell my students is, we can only change what we first love. It's how God works with us. God loved us when we were still God's enemies. So we can only change what we first love. And that's true of a country. That's why Martin Luther King was so effective, because you could sense his grief and love about the country not living up to its own deepest values. It's why anybody that I've seen be successful at community change has loved the community. It's why anybody I've seen, any pastor I've seen be successful at congregational change has loved the congregation. People respond to that. They can feel if we love them or if we don't. And to be an effective change agent, we have to love people. Jesus modeled that.
David, in the examples where you were talking about interfaith outreach and endeavors, what was it that brought the different? I take it the interfaith things go beyond just the Christian faith. It was other religions also, other religious organizations. What brought them together to? What brought the people within those groups rather than doing their own projects, what brought it into where they got together to do it, and what were the effects upon the congregations or those groups that chose to work with somebody from the outside?
Yeah, so in Lancaster, I was part of something called the Lancaster Peace and Justice Coalition, and this had formed 20, 30 years ago, but it was primarily pastors and other Christian lay people. And we ended up starting a community development loan fund that's now called Community First, I believe. And if you folks in Millersville have heard of it, it does affordable housing and small business loans throughout South Central and Eastern Pennsylvania. So it emerged to become a nonprofit, a very successful nonprofit. In Arizona, I was part of a group of 10 Christian congregations that started Seeds of Hope, which was a community ministry that did outreach through that part of Southern Arizona, particularly with at-risk youth, homeless, and very low-income communities or neighborhoods. And that was because the pastors realized what they were doing individually wasn't making much of a difference. They were giving handouts to people to keep them in a motel overnight, but they weren't really able to make any sustainable difference. And they realized they had to come together to do that. And likewise, here in Harrisonburg now, the Faith in Action group that I'm part of, it's because people came to the conclusion that just doing relief work wasn't changing things, and they wanted to address some of the systemic issues and needed to do that across religious lines. So in some cases it was Christian only, and in other cases it was interfaith, but it was always because each congregation realized what they could do throwing a pebble in the pond wasn't enough, that they needed to work together with other congregations. And I think it was revitalizing for the congregations themselves, not just for the community. Okay, I was told that we were to finish at 4:15 and I went past time, so my apologies. But I really would like to close with a prayer, and including for Conrad's wife, Heidi, because the reason he's not with us is that he needed to attend to her. There's some medical need that she's receiving help for right now, but I promised him that we would pray for her. So will you join me in prayer? Dear God, thank you for this group, for the wisdom and experience that's represented here. We thank you for each congregation that is represented and for the life and love in those congregations, for the ministry that they offer to congregational members as well as beyond their doors. Help us to be like Jesus and to recognize that you call us to serve each other, to serve our neighbor, and to love even our enemies. We also pray for Conrad and Heidi as he is with her and she's receiving the attention that she needs. Pray for your healing touch on her. Lord Jesus Christ, you are the Lamb of God, for you take away the sin of the world. Have mercy on us and receive our prayer. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all very much. Enjoyed being with you. Blessings in
David.
your work.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
God bless you all.
Bye now.
And you.